What's up, gang? Welcome to the Greatness Machine. I'm your host, Darius Today. I'm so pumped to have you here with me. Now listen, the Greatness Machine, we're about two things. Number one, people who are living their passions. And number two, those who are creating greatness in the world and doing both of these things despite the odds against them. Each episode, we're going to feature interviews with game changers, business leaders, telling us their origin stories, what made them tick, what got them to where they are now. Why? So it can help you step into your greatness within your life, your business, and your career. Occasionally, you might hear a few solo episodes from myself, moi, as I leverage my 20 years of entrepreneurship as a CEO and founder to help you grow and level up in your journey to scale your life and your business. So come be a fly on the wall, enjoy the conversation, and I'm stoked to have you here with me. Guys, welcome to today's episode of The Greatness Machine. I'm your host, Darius Today, and boy, do we have a special guest. Adam Galinsky is in the house. What's up, Adam?
What's up? Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, man, I am so pumped. Coming to New York tomorrow to get into the cold. And I was like, I've been grinding every day. And when I was reading the prep for the show, I'm like, oh, man, this guy wrote a book about inspiration. That is exactly what I'm in the mood for right now. So, man, I'm so pumped to have you here. Thank you for coming on.
I'm equally pumped.
So, guys, you guys all know that I'm kind of a book warrior, and I love bringing authors on the show because with author is you are the authority on the subject, and Adam here is definitely the authority on something big that's important in all of our lives, inspiration, and we're going to be talking a lot about the word inspire today, which is the title of his new book. But his PR agency 48 reached out to us, and I was telling him before the show, I'm like, man, and then we've got some really interesting people from them, but it's hard to get on the show. And I saw the title of the book. I saw he's promoting his book's coming out next week, and I'm like, oh, how can I help? I want to inspire people, and if I can help them, inspire them with your book, the more the better. So, really pumped about that. I'm going to give your quick bio, and then I'd love to jump into origin story here at the Greatness Machine. Adam, we love origin stories.
Awesome.
So we'll go into some origin, and then we'll see where the rabbit holes take us today. You down for that?
Let's do it.
All right. So you guys, Adam is a professor of leadership at Columbia Business School. He's published over 300 scientific works and co-authored the best-selling book, Friend and Foe. He delivered the popular TED Talk, How to Speak Up for Yourself, with over 7.7 million views. And he's the author, as I mentioned, of Inspire, the Universal Path for Leading Yourself and Others, coming out January 21st. So you guys got to go out there and support Adam. So, man, doing some really cool things out there. I know that people aren't wake up one day and they're just a leading authority and expert on the power of inspiration. Would love to know a little bit about your background, a little bit about your origin story, Adam.
Sure. I grew up in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. I was one of the most interesting things about my origin story is I was a surprise twin. So back in 1969, when I was born, my parents did. There was an ultrasound down in North Carolina, and when my mom delivered my older brother, who's older by 2 minutes, the doctor said, "That uterus looks too big for that baby. I'm going back in. That baby's too small for that uterus." And so came in, pulled me out, and there I was. And they told my dad, they said, good news, the second one's breathing. And my dad was like, what? The second one?
No way.
And I think that's a big part of my life, because when I was born, my brother was about 50% larger than I was. So he was over 5 pounds and I was like 3.5 pounds. So he was just, I had to be in an incubator. He got to go home. He ran faster than I did. He got into gifted, talented programs before I did. So I think there's always a little bit of element of striving, forward and, really discovering what we're good at. In college, long story, but I ended up being a psychology major. And like most psychology majors, I thought that I wanted to be a clinical psychologist. So after college, I got a job at Mass General Hospital doing psychiatric research in Boston, Massachusetts. And I got fired on the, I think, 89th day of my employment. You have to fire people before 90 days. And because I was a shitty worker. It was funny. I started to reflect at that moment in time, and I realized I had not even taken abnormal psychology. So there's nothing in any of my behavior that has suggested I'd be interested in clinical psych other than that's what I thought was. And I realized I'd taken all these classes in social psychology and group psychology. And so I ended up just putting a little sign up at Harvard University, and their psych department said, if you need an RA, call me. And one of the professors called me, and I ended up working with him as a full-time RA for the year. And then realizing that I really love social psychology and got a PhD at Princeton University. And then I went on the academic job market and I applied to 50 psychology departments and I got 0 interviews.
Oh.
But I applied to 3 business schools, Kellogg, Chicago, and Stanford. And I got interviews at both Kellogg and Chicago. And I ended up going to Northwestern, to the Kellogg School of Management, which, just for anyone out there, is like turned out to be winning the lottery, because my salary was more than twice as much as a psychology professor. I had to teach fewer classes and I had more research resources. So that sort of led me down the road towards doing eventually leadership research and teaching. That's
so cool. So yeah, man, I actually, like, it's funny enough, I was moving so fast I didn't even look up. You're smarty pants, Harvard and Princeton. There you go.
Like I said, my brother, and this is a true story. My brother in 3rd grade got into the gifted and talented program and I didn't. And then in 6th grade, he got into the junior high school gifted and talent program. And I didn't. And my parents asked if I could retake the test. And they said, we got to hire someone. And it turned out that I ended up doing really well. And then in my Psych 1 class at Harvard, I found out that some people who are very socially oriented do much better in IQ tests that's given by person than by paper. So that's sort of another part of my story.
I'm going to have someone give me an IQ test then, and maybe I'll get a few more points. I'm super social. So you'll appreciate, I'm a twin as well.
Oh, I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah. Are you identical or are you fraternal?
Fraternal.
Yeah, so we share twinship in common. So I am a fraternal twin. My first company I had was called Twin Capital Mortgage because I'm a twin brother. My twin brother's been my business partner now for 25 years.
That's amazing.
So yeah, so man, let me ask you a question. We'll talk about twins for a second, and I'd love to go back to the origin and the business side of the fence. Have you had twin moments where you're like, I got to call my brother right now, and just something happened? Does that ever happen to you guys?
That's not really happened to me as much. But one thing I do think is really fascinating about looking at the research on twins, and you might appreciate this, is research. This is more research on identical twins. But identical twins reared apart are often more similar than identical twins reared together. Now you think, okay, you have the same genes and the same environment, you should be more similar. But what happens is, and I think this happened with my brother, even though we're identical, is you start to differentiate yourself from each other, right? My brother was, he was a total asshole to teachers. And literally, I remember in 9th grade, he walked in the classroom and a teacher said, Michael, I want you to leave. I can't deal with you today. He's like, I haven't done anything. He's like, just leave. And so in contrast, I became the person that all the teachers loved, right? So there is this sort of ways that we find our own, unique features. So I do think there's something fascinating about twins and siblings in general and how we try to find our own unique way in a family and in the world.
Interesting. My brother was the asshole and I was I was the teacher's pet. They loved me. But they would say crazy stuff to me like, what's wrong with your brother? He's going to end up in jail. And I'm like, well, you don't say that to a 10-year-old.
Yeah, exactly.
I grew up in the 80s. So that was par for the course.
They said it more when he was 14, but yeah, about the similar type of thing,
So what's your brother do? What's his
He is a documentary filmmaker. He's had a number 2 movies shortlisted for the Academy Award and
nice.
Just made some amazing things. And I've been sort of a associate executive producer on some of these movies, meaning I gave him money to help make the movies. He's very creative. And I think one way that my brother and I are similar is that when we see something happen in the world, I think that would make a great research study, right? And he thinks, that would make a great movie. And so we're both looking at the world and sort of trying to understand it.
Yeah, almost like a social context around the happenings of the world. Yes. I love that. That's cool, and it's coming from this study scientific brain versus the creative, the left and right side of the brain, right? Kind of meeting in the middle there. That's cool.
Yeah.
I heard something, I don't know if I saw it on social media or something, but they were saying that twins that they basically talk in utero from communicate in utero from I think it's from like 1 or 2 months in utero.
It's crazy.
Have you heard this? Anything around this? It was something like where it blew my mind, where they're like hugging each other and talking and interacting.
I think I was probably saying in utero, stop taking all the food. Because he was so much bigger than I was, What was the size difference between you and your brother? About the same?
No, so you were it sounds like you were premature. Is that correct?
About 3 weeks. Yeah.
Yeah, we were about 4 weeks premature. I was the healthier one, and he was the more sickly one. And this is in the 70s, so it was about 9 years after you were born. But the technology wasn't probably that different. So we were like they're like, it was dicey. They're like, oh, these guys might not live. And my mom had a cesarean, but I was the bigger one, the healthier one. My brother was in the hospital for a while.
Yeah, I was in the hospital for about 2 weeks. Yeah.
Yeah, but we made it. Like, it worked out for the four of us, right? So
yeah, exactly. We're all still here.
There you go. So going back to academia, so you ended up working at Northwestern. Sounds like that ended up being a very successful opportunity for you. How did you get into, so have you just always been in academia, always been teaching around leadership? Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I've always been, I had that first post-college job that was non-academic and got fired. And then I was a research assistant, then got a PhD, and then, became a professor. So I've been in the academic world for a long time. And the way that I started doing, my original love was negotiations, and I still love negotiations, teaching and doing research on it. And it's one of my, I was just working on a paper literally at 6:00 this morning, scientific paper where we analyzed every single study that's ever been conducted that varied first offer, who made it, the size of the first offer, the sequence of offers, to try to figure out some sort of scientific truths about, should you go first? Should you go ambitiously? What are the costs? What are the benefits of doing so? And then at some point I was basically told, you have to start teaching leadership. And I did not want to at first, because it seemed more daunting, and I hadn't been a leader. I've kind of been a negotiator my whole life. So that sort of fit. And so I ended up, teaching this class and really just falling in love with the variety of, because a leadership class, you're teaching people how to make better decisions, lead teams, create cultures, lead change. So it has all these elements and negotiate. And so, I just started doing that. But the book Inspire, it has a very specific origin, which I'm happy to tell you about now or in a little bit.
Before we go into the book, I just had a quick question for you.
Yeah.
So do you know Alex Carter? She teaches negotiation at the Columbia Law School.
I don't know Alex Carter. No.
Yeah, Alexandra Carter. She's like this famous kind of like woman she's like this she's like a negotiator. She's a lawyer, but she teaches at Columbia. Anyway, check her out. You will probably like her stuff.
I will.
But let's jump into the book.
Yeah. So I mean, the origin story of the whole book was. Well, there's two things that happened. One is in January of 2006, so it's about to be the 19th anniversary of this moment. I got on a plane at 9 p.m. going out to LA, landed at midnight. And when I landed, my cell phone just erupted with, messages. This was before text messaging, so I probably had like 30 voicemails, and my brother called, my twin brother is like, call him no matter how late, so I called him about 3:15 a.m. New York time, that's where he was at the time, and found out that my dad had been hit by a car and killed. Just incredibly just devastated. And the only real saving grace was my dad's only sibling. His sister actually lived in LA. So I was able to go stay with her, and the next day fly back to North Carolina, where my mom was, and be with her and my family. And when she opened the door, my aunt, I saw her, and we hugged, right, in this sense of sorrow and but also comfort. And I plaintively said to her, I said, I can't believe I've lost my dad. And she said to me, we've all lost a dad. I was his big sister, but he was my dad. And that line just stayed with me. I kept persevering on it, why did it ring so true? Right. We've all lost a dad. I was his big sister, but he was my dad. And then I started to realize, at his memorial service, how many people came up and told me how much my dad had changed their life, how much he had meant to them, how much that he had inspired them, to be a better version of themselves, he was a clinical psychologist and taught at UNC psychology, how to be a better therapist, right? And, even his personal trainer at the gym, my dad was 71 at the time, he came to the memorial service and talked about like how much my dad meant to him and given him advice, and so that was sort of happening. And then about a month after that, I was teaching for the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation.
Yeah.
And one of the agents just started talking about how much this mentor that he had inspired him. And I was so struck by the physical change as he described this person. He sat up, his eyes got big, he was smiling, he was almost wistful, he was animated. And so I actually turned to the rest of the agents and I said, can any of you describe, a leader that inspired you? And they all could. And they all kind of felt almost compelled to share this story. So I dramatically changed all of my teaching. I starting every time I taught leadership, that was the first question I asked people. I would say, tell me about a leader that inspired you, like someone that changed you inside, right? They created that sense of positive energy, that wellspring of hope and possibility. And I asked people, what was it about that person? I want you to pinpoint, be a scientist. Tell me the exact, characteristic, attribute, behavior, what it was that they did or said or were that inspired you. And then the next year I was teaching the FBI again. And another agent, I was doing this activity and the agent said, I don't want to talk about someone that inspired me. I want to tell you about someone that really pissed me off. The opposite leader, someone that just, excuse my language, fucking infuriated me, right? And I was like, tell me. And so then I asked the rest of the class, can you tell me about a leader that infuriated you? And I started to realize very quickly two things. The first thing is that the inspiring leader and the infuriating leader were literally mirror images of each other, right? So like the inspiring leader would see the big picture, but the infuriating leader was pedantic and small-minded. The inspiring leader was courageous, right, versus cowardly. The inspiring leader, was generous and elevated people versus, selfish and pushed people down. And so I realized that there was kind of existed on this continuum, right, and that we really sort of evaluated and were affected by people. Now, notice, right, this person, the infuriating people, also changes you inside. Right, creates this like seething cauldron of rage and resentment. So you have this wellspring of hope and possibility. Then you have the seething cauldron, of rage and resentment. And then the second big insight was that I've asked tens of thousands of people this question. And so the second big insight is that all of those attributes can be reduced to three universal factors. So that means that there's not a single attribute that's been mentioned in one country that's not mentioned in every other country in the world.
And so, wow, that's a lot there. So let me ask you a question. Did you find that there was people that did both that were
yes, absolutely.
Because there's almost like, I was an athlete growing up and I interviewed, Guy Kawasaki on the show. Are you familiar with his work? He was like the chief evangelist at Apple. And he talked about this. He's like, some of the best teachers are the ones that push you the hardest, right? And that you don't like them, right? But they get the most out of you. And so when you were talking right now, I was actually thinking of a couple different people. And I'm like, there's people that I like that infuriate me, that have infuriated me in my life, but they've also motivated me. And I've seen both elements of that. So is it, obviously, like we're not black and white, the things are not just, binary. Is it in your data and in searching through, interviewing thousands of people, is there an element of someone that is, is both someone who infuriates to get you inspired and also can be visionary and help you get inspired because they're thinking big too?
Yeah, absolutely. So two things I'll say about that. The first is, I think one of the most important things that my research has discovered is that leaders aren't born, they're made. And the reason why I say this is because it's our current behavior that inspires or infuriates. So there's, I think, two different real strong implications of this. The first implication is you can be infuriating today, but inspiring tomorrow. So we can learn to be more inspiring. We can develop the attributes. the second thing is I mentioned these 3 universal attributes, which I can go through in a little bit more detail, but you could be high on one and low on another, right? And so I think one of the examples is you could be really high on being visionary, right? Seeing the optimistic big picture, simplifying it, visualizing it, and just be a total prick to other people, right? And sometimes you mentioned, one of the things that we have to do is we have to find that right balance between these competing forces. And I think one of the toughest ones is between encouraging people, but also, not just blowing smoke up their butt, challenging them to be the best person that they can be. And so that's one of the things. So one of the things that was remarkable about my dad's memorial speech that I wrote for him, I actually called it My Dad the Advisor after my aunt's comment about him being everyone's father, was that so many people talked about how much he meant to them and how much he encouraged them. But also he challenged them to be the best person they can be. Like, he didn't like mediocrity. He wanted people to strive for perfection, even if they would never reach it. And so I think finding that balance. And so I think one of the things that I've developed is the Am I Inspiring assessment. And you can find that on my website, adamgalinsky.com. And it allows you to see, where do I stand on these 3 primary dimensions of being inspiring?
So when it's funny when you're talking, I started thinking about, our friend over at Apple, Steve Jobs, right?
Yeah, I was going to mention Steve Jobs immediately when you said inspiring and infuriating,
Yeah. Elon Musk is kind of cut from the same cloth.
Yeah.
These are guys that's like, we're going to do things you otherwise couldn't do. I was listening to a Ryan Holiday book yesterday. He was talking about the reality distortion field of Steve Jobs. I can get it done in 2 weeks, you can get it done in 1 week. And when they're saying 6 months, he's saying 1 week, right?
Yeah.
And Musk is famous for this. So is that kind of what you're talking about? These folks that they're like, they get you to go break your back to do something big, you do it, but you're like, that guy's a dick. Like, I don't like that.
That's one element, right? Like the inspiring visionary. So I'll just tell you really quickly, the 3 elements are being visionary. So this is how we see and describe the world, right? Being an exemplar desired behavior, which is how we are in the world, and being a great mentor, which is how we interact with others in the world. And so, a classic trope would be, right, the person who's high in visionary but infuriated on mentor. So really amazing person at seeing the big picture. Another element of being a great exemplar is being coming up with creative solutions, right? This idea of like their ability to discover things that other people couldn't discover. And I think those are really important. But here's one thing I want to say about Steve Jobs, which I think is so fascinating. Like, people talked about his brilliant intuition, right? Like, he could sniff, the winds of which way technology was going and sort of foresee the future. And if he told you an intuition that he had about technology, you should listen to him. But Steve Jobs also made a fatal error, which is he trusted his own intuition about his health, and he took way too long to get his cancer treated and eventually died. And it was so funny because there's these 2 New York Times articles 2 days apart from each other, one describing his amazing intuition in technology, and the other describing his, fatal intuition in health. And like, he wasn't an expert in health, right? But, sometimes we get deluded and get overconfident in our own abilities because we're so good on this one domain, but we're horrible in another domain, right? The person who's incredible at work, but horrible at the dating world, right? Would be another example of that.
Yeah. How's the saying? The Lord does not give with both hands.
Yes.
So
that's right.
It's like, hey man, like you don't win at everything.
Yeah.
But it's a bummer though, right? And you see like, oh, you changed the world in all these ways, but you didn't do the one thing that you could have done to like save yourself. I mean, he had pancreatic cancer, so that's a tough thing to win.
It's a tough one to win. But I think most people would agree he waited far too long to have the initial surgery.
So let's talk about the other. I know we talked about visionary. You want to dive deeper on those subjects a little bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think here's one thing I would say is that the one thing that my research has uncovered is, there's 3 kind of elements to being, I think, or 4 elements really to being visionary. But the first one is, having an optimistic big picture, right? And that's a pretty obvious one. And often that's based in values. And I know you've thought a lot about values and values of companies and organizations. But the other three, I think, are ones that we often lose sight of. So the second one is simplify, right? Like I call it the Inception rule, because in the movie Inception, he says, it's not how deep you go, it's how simple you go. And visualize. So here's one of my favorite studies that I'm currently working on. The data are very clear. We're trying to replicate it in a British context, but we analyzed every convention speech of Democrats and Republicans for since World War II, and we know everything economically about the state of the world, then GDP, unemployment, inflation. We know if they're incumbents, right? We know what party they come from, et cetera. And we just analyzed the amount of visual metaphorical language in the speeches. And we could predict who wins and loses, controlling for economic factors, controlling for other things. And so there's something about we don't remember, or we need to recognize that there's something about visual language that really matters. And here's just one example that I love, is the difference between our mission is to make our customers happy versus our mission is to make our customers smile. And you can now see the smile, right? There's something more visual about that. And so that's, so you want this big picture, optimistic vision of the future that's simplified and visualized. And then the final thing is repeat it, right? You want to be able to repeat the thing. Like, what does every song in the world have? A chorus.
Okay, I was gonna say, I'm like, I was going to say like something about love, but then I was like, no.
A chorus, a refrain, and that tells us something fundamental about the human mind, right? It wants this recurring vision repeated again and again.
So, it's funny, while you were talking, I quickly took your assessment.
Oh,
and so when we talk about like when going back to what you just said a moment ago, I'm like, oh, I'm gonna make this part of the show.
Yeah.
By the way, this is super cool. So can I give people the where they could go to find this?
Yeah.
So if you go to adamgalinsky.com, we'll put this in the show notes, and there's an Are You Inspiring like quiz, essentially assessment. So you could take it. It's pretty quick. It took me like 1 minute while we were chatting on the show. So when we going back to what you said a moment ago,
so just tell me what were you highest on?
Exemplar.
Oh.
I'm 87% exemplar.
Okay.
I'm 63% visionary and 80% mentor.
Oh.
So what does that mean?
I mean, it just means that, well, first of all, you're very high on each of the dimensions. And so it also helps you think about the fact that, are there ways that you could be more visionary? So could you see the big picture? Could you simplify it? Could you repeat it more often? Could you visualize it, right? All those things that we just talked about. It's a way for you to sort of think about how could I take that next step to be even more inspiring?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've taken there's an assessment called Rocket Fuel, and I scored really high on that one on visionary. But what I've learned, which is funny because your questions were more around like, do you simplify things and make it clear and kind of, and there's a quote in marketing called people buy clarity. I don't know if you've heard that before.
Yeah.
But people buy clarity, right? And so I found that I tend to overcomplicate things a little bit. Yeah. And so I'm like, it is something I'm working on actually, but that's really interesting. So someone like myself that scored, pretty high on exemplar and pretty high on mentor. And it was funny, before you even kind of went through it, I was like, oh, I'm pretty sure I'm gonna be pretty high on those.
Yeah.
But I didn't, the visionary one was kind of interesting though. So with this,
but another thing you can do, right, is you can get someone else to do it for you. Say, rate me on this, dimension, and then you can see if there's a correspondence. So, do they see me as the exemplar that I see myself, for example?
Interesting. Okay. So is it? It's like leadership in the art of self-deception, right?
Yeah, a little bit, but but it's a tool that can be used in multiple different ways. Yeah.
Interesting. So when we start talking about, going back to what you were saying before, to go a little deeper on that, it's talking about really, if we want to inspire, we want to create that vision, what are some ways that when you're thinking of obviously we can use someone like a Jobs or a Musk, which are the end of they're the anomaly, right? They're doing, but anyone can do it the same way, just maybe not create the same outcome from a changing the world perspective. How do you think about that?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. One is, there's this level of optimism, right, that I think is really critical. And so, I call the infuriating leader the pessimistic pedantic, right? Or, person who just small-minded and is a naysayer and everything. So I do think there's something incredibly value about optimism, like today's horrible, but tomorrow's going to be better, right? And I think one of the most brilliant examples of that is Make America Great Again. Regardless of whether you support Donald Trump or not, I think everyone would agree that Make America Great Again is fantastically visionary in its simple optimism, right? Like through, in this case, through my philosophy, we will make America great again. And so I think that there's something really important about that. One of the things that I've shown in my research, and I think this is something really important, is that we can become more visionary and when we reflect on our values. And let me tell you really quickly about a study we did, which I'm really proud of, is that we worked with a Swiss employment agency. I had a postdoc who got his PhD in Switzerland and was doing a postdoc here at Columbia Business School. And so we were able to work with a Swiss employment agency. And when people get unemployed, it's a traumatic event, right? It's one of the 5 biggest stressors. I got, mentioned I already got fired from my first post-college job, and I was humiliated and embarrassed, and, depression, anxiety, suicide risk, all these things. And in Switzerland, to get unemployment benefits, you have to go register in person at this employment agency. And what we did is we had half the people essentially were assigned to experimental condition, where they simply asked them for about 10 minutes, think about your top 4 or 5 values and put them in a hierarchy with your most important value first. Think about why these are your most important values. What is it about these values that matter to you? And then third, think about ways you've demonstrated those values sometime in your recent life. 2 months later, the people in the experimental condition, the values reflection condition, were twice as likely to have found a job. That the effect was so strong, we ended the experiment and gave everybody the values intervention. Also saved the government a ton of money because they didn't need as many unemployment benefits. And so, that's an example where there's something about reflecting on our values gives us that surge of optimism, that sense of agency, that, like you said, this can-do attitude that I can accomplish what seemed like impossible the day before. And so our values are really the rocket fuel of being visionary.
Yeah, interesting. So it's funny when you say that is like the way I've always talked about it is like, I've worked with a lot of entrepreneurs and CEOs do this in their business, and I do it. My hobby is to help people do their personal values, but I would say like your values are how your vision come to life, right? Like the top of the pyramid is if I live my values, right? That's the how, that's the day-to-day grind, but the North Star is that vision. Like I want to create a life that looks like X, right? Yeah. But it's a conglomeration of those values kind of coming together and forming that outcome. So that's interesting. It's interesting that they had. I think that really kind of lends way to people, self-actualizing and being their best selves. And if you're going to be your best self, then you're going to go out there and you're going to have you're going to interact with people more, and you're going to interact with them in a better way. And lo and behold, like twice as many of them got better. Twice as many got better jobs. Is that what you said?
Or just got a job.
Got a job, right?
2 months. 2 months afterwards, they were twice as likely to have gotten a job. Yeah.
What are your thoughts around, as you were saying that, I thought about the word hope, right? And like, how do you think hope comes into that? Or how, I don't know if that was part of that, like analysis.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think hope is really important. It's so funny, I write in the book, I say, I always thought that Barack Obama's 2008 campaign slogan was hope. It turns out was I think it was a change we can believe in, but there was that poster that had the word hope with a stencil. And so that became in some ways what people's mind. I think hope is, Trump gave people hope, right? That's one of the things he did with, and you might be down today, but, if you elect me, there's going to be hope around the corner. And I think that's an incredibly essential part of being visionary. We talked about, exemplar before, and you said you scored highest on that. And one of the things we talked about pre-show was like that this is your passion, right? Being a podcaster is your passion. And so one of the things that I've done a lot of research on and with one of my former doctoral students at Harvard Business School now, Yanya Himowitz, is about passion. And so one of the things we do in our research, and it's a really fun thing any one of your listeners can do, is just go up to like a friend of yours and or even, someone that you don't know that well and say, tell me about a passion of yours. So when I teach, even with 1,000 people in the audience, I say, turn to the person next to you and describe a passion of yours for about a couple minutes. And then I'll say switch. And then if you're the listener, now you share your passion. And then I ask people to tell me what they noticed about their partner when they describe their passion.
Mm-hmm.
And they'll say they notice 5 behavioral things, right? And we can document them in videotapes, right? Their eyes light up. Like some people call it, big sparkling eyes, right? They smile, big beaming smile. They talk faster with a little higher pitch. They use their hands more and they lean in kind of as telling you a secret. And I say, to people, what happened to you as you listen to the passion? And they say, my eyes started to light up. I started to smile, right? I could feel that their passion, like that energy start to percolate inside of me. And I think that's one of the reasons why passion is so foundational to inspiring others, is because of our passion is in some ways contagious or infectious to other people. And so, I have that as this kind of a separate category from being visionary, which is the passion or the fuel that really drives you, but it's really what people are perceiving in your body language, essentially. Another really important part of being an exemplar is what I call being a calm and courageous protector, right? In the time of crisis. And one of the things I coined a phrase, which I think is a really important phrase, and it tells us why, as a leader, we will either inspire or infuriate, but neutral reactions is not an option, is because of what I call the leader amplification effect.
Mm-hmm.
And the leader amplification effect just basically says all of our behaviors, expression, words, right? Good and bad, small and, large, verbal and nonverbal, right? They get amplified because when we're a leader, there's more eyes on us. And because of that amplified signal, our reactions are intensified. So I always say, like, when you're calm, other people are calm, and when you're anxious, other people are anxious. But when you're a leader and you're calm, it really soothes people down. But when you are, as a leader, anxious, that really ramps people up. And there's a story I tell in the book about Tammy Jo Schultz, who was captain of Southwest Airlines 1380 when an engine exploded and tore a hole in the side of the plane. And a woman was fatally sucked into that hole. And as she's flying it, she's saying, this plane wants to descend, so I'm going to let it do what it wants to do. But she realized, she's kind of visionary, she realized for the passengers back there, if they didn't have a vision, they think descending is crashing, right? So she got on the intercom and she very calmly said 10 words. We are not going down. We're going to Philly. And the people said, those 10 words, transformative, both in their giving meaning to that experience, being visionary, but also the calmness and the straightforwardness in which she said it made them all trust her. And so one person said, it turned panic into possibility.
That's interesting. And I think you, like where my head went as you're talking about that is, this is like the responsibility of leadership, right? And so, yeah, tell me your thoughts on this. I mean, like, we're all human. We all react. The fact that she was able to muster that up in that moment is probably not normal.
Yep.
We have these animalistic responses based off of hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, where we're like looking over our shoulder for lions and tigers and bears. And so, yeah, tell me about that. Like, do you think that if this is something that if you are a leader, knowing that your behavior, your emotions, which are energy and motion, are essentially amplifying those around you, how do you think about, like, is that just like, hey, I need to like build that muscle of responsibility so that I don't react, or I know that I don't get to react because I am in a leadership role? Tell me your thoughts on that.
So I think 2 things I'll say about that. The first thing I'll say is that you're exactly right. Like, experience is one of the most important things, and like practiced experience, right? And Tammy Jo Schultz, she was in the Army. She's one of the first pilots to fly a certain type of I think, FA fighter pilot, first female, sorry, to fly one of these FA fighter pilots. And, she's just incredible. And she had this experience. But also you use the word leadership as responsibility. And I think when we treat it as a responsibility, that can actually be calming rather than anxiety producing. So let me just give you an example. I find that when I'm traveling, let's say internationally with my family, I have a 7-year-old, 8-year-old, my wife, and, we're all going somewhere. Sometimes my mother-in-law is with us too, is I find it much more calming taking care of them. Like I know I'm responsible for them. The focus isn't on me, right? I'm focused on them, and that focus on them directs me away from, let's say. But if I'm traveling internationally by myself, I feel so much more anxious because I'm just focused on my own experience. And so one of the things, there's this, the phrase is like, do you need to love yourself before you love someone, or do you need to love someone before you can love yourself? That's idea. But I do, one of the things that I've studied is that there is a calming power in perspective taking. My dissertation at Princeton University was called perspective taking, right? And I've shown in a lot of ways that when we can take the focus off of ourselves, we can actually be better off. And let me give you one example, a famous study from the 1970s that I absolutely love. They just took two people, let's say it's me and you, right? And you say, Adam, you're the student, you're going to learn this information, and then you're going to be tested on it by Darius. Darius is the teacher. He's going to also, teach you also a little bit more about the information. So you read it for 20 minutes to prepare to teach it to me. I read it for 20 minutes to learn it and then to be taught by you. And then we get the test before anything else happens. So we've just had the same material for 20 minutes. You will learn it better than I will because you were the teacher. So by being in that mindset of like, I got to integrate this information, I got to be able to put it into a package that I can share it with someone else, you learn it more effectively. Similar type of thing in negotiations. Like you put someone in negotiation, you said to them, okay, your friend's going in this negotiation. What advice would you give them? All of a sudden they see the big picture, right? It's a totally different thing, So one of the things I try to tell people, is, before going into negotiation, imagine you're giving advice to yourself. So kind of separate yourself. So there's something I think very powerful, that psychological distance is what it's often called, that allows us to be visionary, right? That allows us to be calm, allows us to take a step back and sometimes even empower other people.
Yeah, I love that. As you're saying all that, one of the things that kind of crept up in my brain was the word self-reliance.
Yeah.
Right. Like really mastering oneself. I've been on this huge like stoicism kick where I'm like, I'm reading meditations every day, and I'm literally like every single day just studying stoicism, and it's the mastery of self. Right. And when you're talking, I was just thinking, I'm like, this is really just the mastery of self. Right. Like, how do I master myself to show up in the world in the most highest likelihood way of creating inspiration to those around me? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And so one of the things I always ask when I teach, I think it's a really important one, is tell me a time when you were infuriating, right? What led you to be infuriating? And the number one answer that comes up is, I was just tired, right? I was fatigued. I didn't have the cognitive, psychological resources that I needed to be present, or I got annoyed, or I was hungry, or I was mad at my spouse, or I was in a novel environment, or I was just under pressure, right? Time pressure, high stakes pressure, crisis pressure from above, and so, what I'd like to say is, like I mentioned, this continuum, this inspiring, infuriating continuum, the world slants us towards the infuriating side of it, right? All of the slings and arrows of like outrageous fortune that occur every day in our lives. And so we need to find, two things. The first is, how do we reduce those slings and arrows? So like, how do we train ourselves to get better sleep or to meditate every morning, right? How to identify when we're mad at our spouse so we don't take it to work, right? Those are one thing. And the second thing is how, when we can't regulate those things, we can still handle them more effectively. So for example, when I'm under time pressure, I'm able to handle that without flying, off the handle. I'm not, Donovan McNabb throwing up in the Super Bowl on the last drive, against the Patriots.
Right.
But I'm Tom Brady, driving against the Rams and winning that first Super Bowl, with less than a minute to go, when John Madden says, go to overtime, and they don't, and they win the field goal. So I think that's part of, really it is about like training yourself. And let me just give you one example of this, which I think is one of the most important ones in my own life, which is my dad. I've already mentioned, is one of the most inspirational people in the world. And I could tell you some amazing stories about my dad, but he had one infuriating flaw, which is that it didn't happen every day, maybe once a week, maybe even not that often. He would just explode in a volcanic rage, and literally I remember one time I literally spilled milk at the dinner table, and he lost his shit, just screaming, yelling, blah, 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 blah. And he was so terrorizing that like I had dreams of, running away from my dad in my nightmares, and, I have two children that were under 2, and my 2-year-old son he would just, be stubborn and have a tantrum, and like a couple of times that same rage that my dad had came out of me, right? And what I saw in my son was he went into a fugue state of just terror, and I realized I can't do that ever again. Like I got to train myself to stop doing that. And I did, I failed a few times, and it would come out but it was shorter, and then I take pride in the fact that, okay, I lost my shit for 10 seconds instead of 20. That's I'm going in the right direction, And so that was that hope and optimism. And then eventually there were times where like he just flipped out and I was just calm. And then I felt so good about myself afterwards. I was like, I did that. Like I set out to do that and I did that. And that's, really, really important.
I love that. What I love best about all this is it's like, I think a lot of times there's like a misnomer that people are like just born that way. We're like, oh, I'm just calm, and maybe some people have more of that than others, right? Or that they're naturally inspirational. And I think we see that with natural, there's this idea of natural born leaders but that's like a cop out if you don't have it, right? Whereas what you're saying, which I think is really important, is like, no, these are skill sets we can all develop. And
Absolutely.
And in fact, we are incentivized to develop them because it's a currency that the world will pay you for.
Yeah.
So that's really cool.
Yeah. And I think, I'll say two things that are important. One is I discovered another scientifically, universally validated manipulation. I created this in 2003 with a colleague at Stanford, Deb Grunfeld, and Joe McGee, who's at NYU. Another reflection task. And this has been used literally in hundreds of experiments across the world, where you just ask people, think about a time when you were powerful and in control. What was it about that experience? Why did you feel powerful and control? Like really reflect on that experience. And then we put them in a negotiation and they get a better outcome. And then researchers in Europe, I didn't do this study, but they used my manipulation, my intervention. They did it before a high stakes speech, and they measured people's physiological reactivity. And the people randomly assigned to reflect on time in which they were powerful and control, they had lower physiological reactivity. They were less anxious, less aroused, and they gave better speeches, right? And so one of the things that we can, I mentioned my own experience of reflecting on it. And so one of the super powers that we can do is we can reflect on those experiences when we were super. And when we reflect on being super, it helps us be more super in the next moment. And the reason why it works is because we're actually leveraging our own authentic experiences.
Yeah, I love that. Man, you're such a wealth of knowledge around these different topics. I'm so excited for the book. I know we're out of time here, but I'd love it, Adam, if you can let the audience know where can they get the book. It's coming out next week. So listeners, like the first week a book comes out, it's a big deal for authors. So I'm going to tell you right now, like, go get the book. I mean, I'm so psyched for this type of information to be out there for folks like yourself to listen to. But if you wouldn't mind, educate our audience, and then we'll get you to the greatness question and get you out of here.
Sure. Yeah. The book is, again, Inspire, the Universal Path for Leading Yourself and Others. You can get it at Amazon, Barnes and Nobles, your local bookstore. You can go to adamgalinsky.com. Also take the Am I Inspiring assessment that Darius already took right here on the show today. And I hope, like Darius said, first week is really, huge and matters. And I hope it inspires you to buy the book.
Definitely. So we'll make sure we put that in the show notes. You guys go out there, support Adam, get the book, get it for your team, get it for your leaders, get it for your loved ones. We all need more inspiration. As he was talking about before, We want those mirror neurons to like inspire people around us. So love to have you all get the book. With that said, let's get to the greatness question. You ready, Adam?
Yep.
All right.
Hit me with it.
Let's do it. What's the number one barrier to creating greatness that you've overcome in your life, and how'd you overcome it?
I would say the number one barrier to creating greatness is anxiety. And I'm not have a clinical problem with anxiety, but like I've been very anxious, especially in high stakes situations. In the world, when I first started giving talks in front of 100 people or 200 people, 300 people, my hands would shake so much, like I couldn't even hold like the little clicker, for the PowerPoint. I've done research on anxiety, and one of the things that I've shown is that anxiety narrows our attention. So when we're anxious, we can't be visionary. We can't see the big picture. I published a paper called Anxious and Egocentric. We can't take other people's perspectives. And we talked about the power of perspective taking, right? And when we're anxious, it's harder to us to be courageous protectors, right? And all those things. And so, finding ways to control your own anxiety, or for me, to control my own anxiety is really important. There's two ways that I've done it. The first way I already mentioned, which is I look outward. Right? If I just focus on myself, it intensifies my anxiety. But if I focus on what I can do for other people, it actually calms me down. And I take great pride in being that protector for others. And so that's a role. So finding, I guess, the role that works for you. And the second thing was, there was, I think about mantras, right? You talked about meditation, mantras, and things like that. And, if any of you saw Tin Cup, Kevin Costner's character would say, dollar bill before swinging the golf club. And if you watch Ted Lasso, he said barbecue sauce, before, throwing the dart, and having that phrase. And there was a TV show called Sports Night that was before The West Wing, Aaron Sorkin's first TV show before The West Wing, in which there was a character, a sportscaster, and he had to go talk at his kid's school, and he didn't know what he was going to do. And, he was nervous and he was anxious, and then he was distracted before going in by the kids at recess. And he said this phrase. And this phrase that he said, I started to say to myself, and it totally worked for me. And the phrase was this. It's like, suddenly I was overcome by a sense of, I know what I'm doing. And in this case, he went inside and he called the highlights. So that's how he impressed his son's class. Like he did injury reports with the kids, et cetera, did little interviews. And so, sometimes, when I get there for a big talk, I was like, look, I know what I'm doing. I've done this before, and again, it's reflecting on that authentic experience of your superness, your success, that I think can help you be a more inspiring person, both for yourself and others. Love it,
Adam. So excited for all the work you're doing, and just so grateful to have you here on the Greatness Machine today. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
The gratitude is all mine. Thank you so much for having me.
You're very welcome. And guys, go out there, support Adam's book. Until next time, peace out. We love you. You are listening to The Greatness Machine, and that's a wrap for today. Listen, if you love what you heard, subscribe to the show on whatever podcast platform that you're tuning in on, so that you don't miss any of our future episodes. We have tons of great people coming on, and we're stoked to have you here to enjoy it with us. Leave us a review. Tell us what you love most about this particular episode. We love getting the reviews. We love to see what you guys love most. And if this particular episode, made you think of someone who's leveling up in their business and in their life, print screen, share it with them. Leaders are the best givers, and after all, we're all here to support and grow with each other. And in case you want to see some of the fun behind the scenes shots or some of the things that we're doing, I'm actually writing about this in my weekly newsletter. Go to www.therealdarius.com and subscribe to my newsletter. We're talking about fun things like business and life and mindfulness and cryptocurrencies and gosh, I don't even know, everything and anything, but it's tons of fun stuff I write about. I try to get it out on a weekly basis. You can subscribe at www.therealdarius.com. And with that said, look, thank you guys so much. I appreciate you. I love you. Peace. We're out of here. See you guys on the next one.
She's my lover.